I stood at the airport with my suitcase in one hand and my printed itinerary in the other, though I had started to suspect something wasn't right. My husband, Greg, chatted with his sister near the gate, while my mother-in-law, Diane, smiled at the counter, saying something to the airline staff. I waited for my turn to check in, but when I stepped forward, the clerk looked puzzled and shook her head. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you're not on this reservation." The words didn't quite land at first. "There must be a mistake," I said, managing a polite smile as I showed my itinerary, though it was just a copy of the group booking details Greg had sent me. I hadn't checked it myself. I trusted them. I always had. Diane walked over. "Oh dear, did I forget to add your name when I booked the tickets?" she asked with a practiced innocence that only made my heart beat louder. "Well, someone has to stay and look after the farm. You know how needy the animals are. I guess this works out perfectly." Greg didn't look at me. Neither did his sister. His father, Arthur, just sighed like it was a minor inconvenience. Not one of them said a word in my defense. Not even when I turned to Greg and asked quietly, "Did you know?" He gave a vague shrug. "Mom said it was tight with the budget. I thought you knew." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I told them I understood, turned around, and walked away. My suitcase rolled behind me like a slow, heavy reminder of everything I had just accepted for too long. Back at the house, the farm Diane never wanted but inherited and made me manage, I sat in the kitchen and stared out the window at the hens scratching in the dirt. I had poured my life into this land for the past 11 years, fed the animals, mended the fences, cooked every family meal, and now not a single one of them had thought I deserved a seat on that plane. But they had handed me something else, a full week, alone, with the house and the farm, and my thoughts. I stood up slowly and reached for a notepad. If I was going to be forgotten, then maybe it was time I reminded them exactly who I was. The morning after they left, the house felt unnaturally quiet. No doors slamming, no Diane criticizing how I folded dish towels, no Greg muttering complaints about chores, just the slow creak of the windmill and the distant clucking of hens. I walked the perimeter of the farm with my coffee, stopping at the fence that Greg swore he'd fixed 2 summers ago. Still broken. Just like the barn roof he promised to patch before winter and the shed door that hung on one hinge. I had fixed most of it myself, quietly, gratefully, as though this life, half given, half earned, was enough. But as I stood by that broken fence, I remembered something Diane had said last Christmas. "You're just good with your hands," she'd smirked, handing me a pile of dishes while Greg's sister opened her 4th gift. "You're lucky we let you stay here at all." Let me stay. The words had never stopped echoing. The truth was, the farm had been in Diane's late husband's name. She inherited it, yes, but it was Greg's father who offered me a room when I first started dating Greg. I was 25, working at a hardware store after my father passed away, with no real home of my own. Back then, Diane had smiled to my face. She even helped sew my wedding dress. But things shifted when her husband died 2 years into our marriage. Diane took over the finances. Greg followed her lead. And I? I disappeared into the work, caring for the livestock, tending the garden, preserving jars of food in the cellar. No paycheck, no title, just responsibility. Until now. I spent the afternoon in Diane's office, where she kept every legal document locked in a cherrywood filing cabinet. I knew the key was taped to the underside of her desk drawer. She never believed I'd have a reason to use it. I did. I read through the will. Her husband had never changed it. The land and house were technically Diane's, but the livestock and equipment? Joint property between her and Greg. No mention of me. 11 years of labor, unrecognized. But what caught my eye was the line about a second plot of land. 5 acres that Greg's father had purchased just before he died. Not adjacent to the farm. Untouched. Registered in Greg's name. I sat back in the leather chair, heart pounding. They left me behind to care for their land. But I wasn't just staying behind anymore. I was laying claim to what they'd never thought I'd touch. By the 3rd day, the air had changed. I stopped moving like a houseguest in my own home and started walking like someone who had lived here for 11 years and deserved better. I called a surveyor. A young woman named Brenda showed up the next morning with a measuring wheel, clipboard, and calm curiosity. "It's not every day someone wants to inspect a plot that's been sitting untouched," she said as we climbed into my old pickup truck. The 5-acre parcel was only 20 minutes away. When we arrived, I almost laughed. It was beautiful. A wide, flat stretch of earth flanked by old trees, with a narrow stream curving through the back. Untamed, yes, but clean. Open. Free. I asked Brenda what it would take to build a structure here. "Permits, of course," she said. "But nothing too crazy. You've got road access and the zoning's still agricultural. Want me to draw up a site plan?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, let's see what it would look like." When I got home, I opened the guest room closet, the one where I had stored everything that made me who I was before this family swallowed me whole. My sketchbooks, my grandmother's quilt, the little dream board I made when I was 26, back when I thought love was enough to build a life on. At the bottom of the closet was a locked box. Inside, my name still shimmered on the savings bond my aunt had left me. I had almost forgotten it existed. I had never touched it. Greg always said we needed everything in one place, and that place was his account. But I had my own, just in case. And I was suddenly very glad I did. Later that evening, I walked through the house with new eyes. I noticed how nothing truly belonged to me. Not the paintings on the walls, not the dining set Diane had generously loaned us, not even the bedspread, which Greg's sister picked out because she thought my style was too rustic. But the land? That untouched stretch of earth? That could be mine. Not through Greg, through action. I spent that night drafting emails to a local attorney, an accountant, and a contractor. Just inquiries for now. But the moment I hit send, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not revenge, not even anger. Freedom, quiet and patient. Like the kind that grows slowly, until one day it stands tall enough to cast a shadow. On the 4th day, I drove into town and opened a private checking account in my maiden name. It felt strange, writing that name again, Darlene Prescott, instead of the one Diane had insisted sounded better on paperwork when I married Greg. I hadn't realized how much of myself I had packed away in drawers and dusty closets just to keep the peace. The bank manager, a woman named Marla, looked me in the eye and said, "Starting something new?" I smiled, slow and sure. "Yes, I believe I am." Back at the farm, I moved with purpose. I walked the barns with a camera, documenting the condition of everything, from the rusted tools to the hay bales I stacked myself just last week. I wasn't entirely sure why I was recording it all. Maybe to protect myself. Maybe just to prove that I was the one doing the work all along. Later that evening, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, staring at the kitchen window where Diane's lace curtains hung. I never liked them. Too frilly, too formal. They always reminded me I was a guest in her world. I took them down, folded them gently, placed them in a drawer. Then I started a fire in the hearth and brought out my sketchbook. The pages hadn't been touched in years, but my hands remembered the rhythm. I sketched the 5-acre land from memory, then added soft lines. An open studio barn, a greenhouse, a small cabin. Nothing extravagant. Just honest. Just mine. I thought about all the skills I'd gained from a decade of being used. Gardening, preserving, repairing, managing animals. Things Diane called chores, but I had turned into expertise. I knew people in town who bought my pickles and jam. People who asked me for advice on livestock feed and herbal tinctures. What if I didn't just build a home? What if I built something for myself that nobody could take away? The attorney wrote back that evening. Her name was Cynthia, and her message was brief but kind. "Happy to assist. I'd recommend setting up a sole proprietorship if you plan to earn from the land. Let's talk more when you're ready." I was ready. The next morning, I began boxing up things that were mine, things I had brought into this house before I became invisible. 1 week ago, I was told I didn't have a place in their vacation. Now, I was starting to believe I didn't need a place in their lives at all. The day before the family was set to return, I stood in the middle of the living room and took in every detail. The framed family photos, none with me in them, lined the fireplace mantel. The couch Diane insisted on buying. The books Greg never read, but liked people to think he did. I picked up a photo from a Christmas 5 years ago. I was there, in the background, blurry and mid-blink, setting a tray on the table. Not one photo showed me smiling. Not one showed me sitting. The doorbell rang just after noon. I froze. But it wasn't Greg. It wasn't Diane. It was Ruth. Ruth had been my neighbor growing up. She was well into her 70s now, sharp as ever, and the kind of woman who always smelled like cinnamon and old paperbacks. "I saw your truck near the South Plot," she said, stepping in without waiting for permission. "Was wondering what you were up to." I told her everything. Not with drama, just facts. She listened, arms crossed, eyes narrowed with quiet fury. "That land your father-in-law bought? I remember when he did it. He told my husband it was meant for you one day. Said you were the only one on this land who ever worked with real pride." I blinked. "He never told me that." "Of course not. Diane made sure nothing ever made it through that woman's filter." Ruth looked me dead in the eye. "You're not just owed that land. You've earned it 10 times over." I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that. It felt like a door unlocking inside me. Before she left, Ruth handed me a folded index card. "When you're ready, call this number. It's a local builder. Quiet, discreet. He helped my niece set up her farm stand business after her divorce. He doesn't ask questions." That evening, I went to the 5-acre plot and stood in the middle of it as the sun went down. I imagined the cabin there, the garden, the wooden porch with wind chimes. I imagined mornings without judgment and nights without cold silence. I imagined choosing every nail, every window, every color of paint. I wasn't running away. I was moving forward. Let them come home. Let them walk through their polished front door with their tan lines and duty-free bags. They wouldn't recognize what had changed, but they would feel it. They came back on a Sunday afternoon, dragging their rolling suitcases up the gravel path like the conquering heroes of some imagined war. Greg had a sunburn. Diane wore new sunglasses. No one asked how things went on the farm. No one asked if I was okay. Diane barely glanced at me before saying, "We brought back a magnet for the fridge. They were handing them out at the resort." She placed it on the counter like it was some sacred offering. Greg gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, distracted, then turned to his phone. "Hope the animals didn't give you too much trouble. We were worried about that old goat." "I managed," I said calmly. "Everything's fine." And it was, for now. I didn't tell them about Ruth's visit. I didn't mention the meetings I had lined up for the following week. I didn't bring up the builder or the surveyor or the legal documents Cynthia had sent over to begin the process of filing for partial asset protection in case I needed it. Instead, I watched. Diane had always prided herself on noticing things, but she didn't seem to notice how I no longer flinched when she critiqued my cooking. Greg didn't notice I had moved all my important documents into a lockbox. And neither of them noticed the missing curtains, or the fact that my wedding photo, just one, had quietly disappeared from the hallway. I was invisible again, but this time, it worked to my advantage. On Tuesday morning, I called the builder Ruth recommended. His name was Calvin, and he showed up in a dusty truck with clean blueprints and a quiet voice. We met on the 5-acre land, away from the noise of the house, away from Diane's judgment and Greg's indifference. He looked around the property and said, "You've got a good start here. Soil's firm. Waterline nearby. You said you want a cabin and a greenhouse?" "That's right," I nodded. "And eventually, a small retail shed. I sell preserves, tinctures, handcrafts." He nodded, scribbling notes. "We can phase it in. Keep things quiet. You want this off the books for now?" "Yes," I said. "This is just mine. I'm not looking to share credit." Calvin didn't flinch. "Then we'll get it done right." By the time I got back to the farmhouse that afternoon, Diane was in the living room, scrolling on her tablet. She didn't even look up when she asked, "Where have you been?" "Out," I said simply. She didn't press. Maybe she thought I was running errands. Maybe she just didn't care. But that night, I wrote in my journal a sentence I hadn't allowed myself to believe for years. They stopped seeing me, and that's the moment I became dangerous. The first delivery came on a rainy Thursday morning. Nothing suspicious, just gravel. Calvin had it dumped by the road near the 5-acre property. "We'll spread it out slowly," he said. "No heavy equipment yet. No paper trail." He respected my silence, and I appreciated his quiet efficiency. At home, Diane was preoccupied with a garden club luncheon, and Greg had taken on extra hours at the farm co-op. I knew their patterns, their moods. I knew how to move unnoticed. Meanwhile, Cynthia had drawn up the first draft of my sole proprietorship filing. She also included something else, a quiet petition for financial partition. If I ever decided to leave Greg officially, the assets acquired from my business would be protected. It was a legal foot in the door. No commitment, just leverage. The kind I never had before. That night, I stood in the kitchen while Greg scrolled through his phone, chuckling at something he didn't share. I asked, "Did your dad ever tell you what he wanted to do with that 5-acre lot?" Greg didn't even look up. Nah, he probably forgot he even bought it. Diane was always annoyed about it, said it was a waste of money. I nodded. That's a shame. Seems like a nice spot. Too small to matter, he muttered. You'd need a miracle to turn it into anything useful. I stirred my tea and smiled into the steam. The next day, I met with Calvin again. We staked out the foundation and walked through a revised plan. Once we get the frame up, we can move fast, he said. You sure you're ready for this? I didn't even hesitate. Yes. Afterward, I stopped by Ruth's place and dropped off a basket of preserves. You didn't have to, she said, smiling softly. I wanted to, I replied. And I wanted you to be the first to know. I'm building. Her eyes lit up. Good. It's time. Driving home, I felt a tension that had been living under my skin for years begin to ease. Not gone, not yet, but easing. The land wasn't just a space anymore. It was becoming structure, walls, windows, a roof that would shelter only what I allowed in. Still, I knew time was running short. At some point, Greg or Diane would notice, and when they did, it wouldn't be quiet. It happened faster than I expected. I had just returned from the site, mud on my boots and a light dusting of sawdust on my sleeves. The frame was halfway up now. Windows were being delivered in 2 days. Calvin worked quickly, respectfully, but visibility was no longer something I could control. The plot could be seen from the back road if someone was looking, and Diane had been looking. She stood on the porch when I returned, arms crossed, her face a cold, practiced mask. I hadn't seen that expression since the day I'd moved in. I drove past the old Henderson Trail, she said flatly. Saw some construction. Funny, isn't it? How you never mentioned anything. I placed my keys in my coat pocket and didn't flinch. I didn't think it would interest you. Her eyes narrowed. That land is in Greg's name. I nodded. Yes, and it was never used. Not once. For over a decade. Not until now. You had no right. I had every right, I interrupted, calm but firm. I've given this family 11 years. Of labor. Of silence. Of being treated like I'm temporary in my own home. The door opened behind her. Greg stepped out, brows furrowed. What's going on? Ask your wife, Diane snapped. She's been building something behind our backs, on your land. Greg turned to me, half confused, half annoyed. Is that true? Yes, I said. I'm building a life, one that doesn't require permission from people who never saw me as more than free labor. Greg stepped down from the porch. Why wouldn't you talk to me about it first? Because the last time I did, you shrugged me off, I replied. Just like you did at the airport. Just like you always have. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the wind stilled. Diane finally hissed. You're playing a dangerous game, dear. No, I said, stepping past her toward the door. I already played the obedient one, and I lost years of my life. Inside, I poured myself a glass of water with steady hands, though my chest thudded with every heartbeat. I knew it wasn't over. They wouldn't let it go easily. But I also knew something else. They were rattled, and I was no longer afraid. The next morning, Greg was already waiting for me in the kitchen. He'd made coffee, his way of softening difficult conversations, but the bitterness still clung to the air. You blindsided us, he said, not meeting my eyes. I didn't sit. No, I protected myself. There's a difference. He sighed. You could have at least told me. We're married. I leaned on the counter. Are we, Greg? Or am I just the one who keeps things running while your mother makes the decisions and you stay comfortably in the middle? He flinched. For once, he didn't argue. I didn't go behind your back, I continued. I finally stepped out from behind mine. Greg's voice was quieter now. So, what is this? Are you leaving? I'm building something, I said. What I do next depends on whether you try to stop me. He looked stunned, like the possibility had never crossed his mind that I might not be his to keep. Later that day, Diane marched into the construction site uninvited. Calvin stood calmly by the framing, clipboard in hand. She pointed at him. You'll be off this land by the end of the week. This is my son's property. Calvin raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, I work for the client listed in the agreement. If there's a legal issue, I'll need it in writing. I stepped out from behind the structure. We already filed the business registration. It's a sole proprietorship. The land is still Greg's, and he hasn't revoked access. Diane's mouth opened, but no sound came out. And before you ask, I added, we've filed for partition protection. Everything tied to this land, and my work on it, will be mine. You're manipulating my son, she spat. No, I said. You did that for years. I'm just giving him a chance to see what it feels like when I stop letting it happen. She turned and stormed off, barking something about lawyers and disrespect. Calvin simply returned to his measurements. That evening, Greg didn't speak much. He sat on the porch, watching the sky. I joined him, quietly. I didn't know it had gotten this bad, he said after a long silence. You didn't look, I replied, and I stopped waiting for you to. He nodded slowly, then asked the first real question he'd asked me in months. What do you want from me now? I looked toward the horizon, where my future was being built one beam at a time. I want you to stop standing between me and my freedom. That's all. The cabin was finished 2 weeks later. Small, but warm. Real. Mine. Pine walls, wide windows, and a front porch that faced the morning sun. Calvin's crew kept their promise. Quiet, clean, efficient. The greenhouse frame was next. I had jars of seedlings ready and shelves lined with the preserves I'd made over the years, labeled neatly by hand. I called the venture Second Root, because sometimes starting over doesn't mean erasing the past. It means planting it somewhere else and letting it grow properly. Cynthia had filed everything by then. My business license arrived in the mail the same day Diane served me with a letter, thinly veiled legal threats scrawled with entitlement. I didn't open it. I handed it to Cynthia. She won't win, she said, scanning it briefly. There's nothing here, just noise. Greg had become distant, quiet. He stopped coming home on time. I didn't chase him for answers. For the first time, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt peaceful. One evening, I left him a note on the kitchen table. Not cruel, not dramatic, just the truth. I'll be living at the cabin from now on. You are welcome to visit, but not to control. I won't fight for space that was never freely given. If you ever want to meet me on equal ground, I'll leave the porch light on. I didn't expect a reply. I didn't need one. The next morning, I packed my final box. I left the farmhouse key on the table, along with the grocery list I used to keep like clockwork. I paused at the door, looked back once, and closed it softly behind me. Out at the cabin, Ruth brought over a housewarming gift, a quilt she had sewn herself. You did it, she said. I did. I placed it on the bed and opened the windows wide. The breeze carried the scent of wild mint and new wood. A sound I hadn't heard in years filled the space, my own breathing, steady and unhurried. Diane never showed up again. Greg came by once, a week later. He didn't come inside. He stood at the porch edge, hands in his pockets. I don't know how to fix what I broke, he said. I'm not asking you to, I replied. Just don't pretend it didn't happen. He nodded and walked away. That was the last I saw of him. These days, I wake up with the sun, drink coffee on my porch, and work the land with joy instead of obligation. Customers trickle in, asking about jam, about herbs, about the story behind the name. I tell them it's about second chances. And when they ask if I live alone, I smile and say, no, I live with freedom,